Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by u/m_ATL518, so credits to him. Whistler or Wendigo in Georgia. Asterisk first post ever on Reddit. Been holding on to this story for a while, and after finding this sub I felt you guys would be interested or have some input on what I could have seen. It's been almost 2 years and I still can't get it out of my head. That whistle. Growing up in the mountains of North Georgia, camping and hiking were things me and my brother did so often it was second nature. So anytime Ryan and I had a break from school we would head straight for the woods. We packed our gear, let our parents know where we were going, and that was that, no questions asked. We decided to camp about midways through Jack's River Trail in the Cayuta Wilderness, and it's a trail we knew fairly well as we had used to a few times before to practice long hikes. We arrived at the trailhead around lunchtime, parked the car, got our gear out, and headed into the woods. We passed a few hikers as moved along and asked them how the trail looked, and the answer was always the same: wet. Jack's River Trail probably crossed the river 50 times as it went along its 17-mile-plus journey, and with the colder temperatures of late fall settling in it was harder for the trail to stay dry. We moved deeper into the trail and started to look for a place to make camp. This is where Ryan and I made our first mistake. You see, Ryan and I have this rule. We don't camp near people if at all possible. Call us paranoid, but the last thing we want is for someone to drag us out of our tents and into the woods never to be seen again. So we always camped a pretty decent ways off of the trail and in the area that wasn't popular with overnight camping. Roughly 2.5 hours or so we found what we thought was the perfect place to set up for the 2 nights that we would be out. That we came up to Horseshoe Bend and ventured about half a mile off the trail into a clearing and set up. We built a teepee fire lay for that night and pitched our tents on either side. After setting up and unloading we decided to walk back to the trail and go exploring around some of many swimming holes Jack's River had to offer. This was during Thanksgiving break, and I remember being surprised at how few people were on the trail. Maybe it was the weather or the fact that this was early in the week, but there didn't seem to be anyone hiking, much less staying the night. Around 5 o'clock Ryan and I headed back to camp to start our fire, make dinner, and settle in for the night. As soon as the sun began to set the cold rushed in. We added more wood to the fire, sat close and just enjoyed conversation. Ryan was 2 years behind me in school. I was a senior and he was a sophomore, but growing up we had always been close. We always hung out in the same groups, played the same sports, had the same hobbies, etc. Around 9 we were settled comfortably around the fire. I had just texted our mom to let her know we were safe and getting ready for bed, and I remember we were talking about dreading going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having the same awkward conversations we had each year with family we only saw on holidays when things started to get strange. We were no stranger to sounds in the woods, and these woods were full of animals, from deer to black bears and even the random wild boar. If you are in the woods enough you learn to distinguish certain sounds, and what we were hearing I can only chalk up to as odd. What Ryan and I heard was what sounded like someone sneaking around slowly just out of eyesight. With an animal walking on 4 legs you hear a tighter group of steps, but what we were hearing sound very distinct to what a human sounds like when walking slowly or trying to move without making much sound. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shone it in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from, but that is what was so weird. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot we thought the sound were coming from, the location of the sound would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple people walking around us. That's when the whistling started. At first I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around and what we are hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing that. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. Over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I heard that, and I put my finger to my lips trying to keep him from talking. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, my fist clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if it was anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through was maybe 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness. "Hey! Quiet!" The whistling stopped. The crunching of the wood stopped. Nothing. I was pissed. I looked at Ryan with a "what the hell" look, and he shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do something," he said. I just shook my head. We sat there in silence for a few minutes when the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was screwing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. That's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud. Inhumanly loud that I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police. Now this is the part one will never forget. The part one never liked to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with a dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried, and thought I would feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes toward the woods, I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light hit it, launched backwards off of the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped an impossible distance or landed in a thicket, because I heard it but never saw. I don't think I have ever yelled so loud. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about what I saw. Maybe 10 minutes later we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view asking if everything was okay. I settled a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement and then heard my scream, and that's when they headed in our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later a park ranger showed up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or some campers trying to mess with us. Either way, Ryan and I decided we weren't staying the night. We packed our stuff up and walked out of the woods with the ranger. He took our statement and we got in our car and drove home. Ryan and I don't talk about what happened that night, but neither of us have been back to Jack's River Trail and will probably never go back. Second story. This story was shared by you/Oberian Synth, so credits to him. Wendigo. It smells like death out here. Babe, stop being dramatic. I covered my nose and carefully stepped over the pile of animal droppings whose smell had so rudely invaded my personal space. I can't believe you tricked me into coming out here, I said. I didn't trick you. I like to think of it as careful coercion. He grinned at me with that perfect smile and I felt my annoyance at nature slipping away. Dalton loved the outdoors and he'd been begging for me to join him on one of his weekend excursions into the deepest parts of the forest. I reluctantly agreed, but only after he pulled out the puppy dog eyes. There was something about those beautiful brown eyes that just melted me down. We had been walking for what seemed like hours, though Dalton revealed to me that it had not even been 30 minutes. I'd always had a taste for exaggeration. I've always liked nature, but purely in small doses. Dalton, on the other hand, was a nature fanatic. He'd spend days, sometimes weeks in this forest. Opposites do attract, I suppose. There was just something about the outdoors that fascinated him. Between the spiders and other various animals that could kill me, I was positive that I did not share the same opinion. Watch out for that spider web, he shouted back at me as he tore through the thick collection of tree branches. Fuck you. I shouted back, with a nervous laugh. Save that for when we get to the campsite, babe. Lord. It's gonna be night soon, I said, basing my information on the small amount of sky that I could see through the opening of our tent. I think anyway. Dalton zipped up the tent and laid down next to me. I grabbed onto him, feeling comfort as I could feel his breathing. He wrapped his arms around me and kissed me on the forehead. I smiled. For just a moment, I forgot that I was now trapped inside a small confined space, helpless against whatever would feel the need to rip my face off and eat at my intestines. You brought food, right? I'm starving, I said. If something eats me, I'd rather it have a full meal. Dalton chuckled. Yes, I brought food. I hope the bears like trail mix. Damn, I was hoping for a 3-course meal, but that'll do. I guess, anyway. You're so unappreciative. That's not true. I appreciate that I'm still alive at the moment. Keep it up, and maybe you won't be. He smiled and pulled me in for a kiss. It was always so hot when he threatened to kill me. You see that one? The one that kind of looks like two people. That's Gemini, I said, trying my best to point out which stars I was talking about. I think I'm a Gemini. No, you're a Libra. Does it matter? Well, no. But still. By nightfall, I had found one more sense of comfort. The stars. Living in a city, we could never see the stars at night. But here, I felt like I could see every star in the universe. It was slightly overwhelming, though my lifelong interest in astronomy helped us pass the time when I couldn't sleep. Where's the Big Dipper? He asked. Ursa Major, babe. No, I said the Big Dipper. Dalton always hated when I corrected him. In my defense, I couldn't help that he was often wrong. I wish I would have brought my telescope. I don't think that would have fit in your backpack. I could have made some sacrifices. I mean, look at the sky, I bet I could see Pluto. Really? I sighed. No, babe. Guess we both had our interests that the other had no clue about. We scurried back into our tent about an hour later, when I saw a huge-ass spider slowly making his way towards me. It's only for a weekend, I kept telling myself. It didn't help. We had only been out in the forest since the afternoon and it had already felt like I had spent my whole life swatting away insects and stepping over plants that I was convinced looked suspiciously too much like poison ivy. I tried my hardest, but the Sandman decided to skip me that night. He was probably shacking up with the Tooth Fairy. I guess I was too nervous to sleep, but at least I was able to feel comfort in Dalton's arms. I normally would have been annoyed by his snoring, but it was a familiar sound compared to the somewhat unnerving sounds of the forest. All the carnivorous animals stepping on twigs as they make their way to sink their teeth into my skin, and the sex-crazed mating calls of all the godforsaken insects that want to infect my blood with 1,000 parasites. I closed my eyes and tried to tune out the sounds of nature and focus on my husband's snoring. I chuckled a bit at the humor of that. I hated his snoring, yet here I loved it. And it seemed to be doing a great job of drowning out all the bugs and whatever else called this forest home. In fact, it seemed to be doing a little too well. I sat up and put my ear against the wall of the tent. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything but Dalton's snoring. It was as if everything in the forest just decided that it was time for a moment of silence for a fallen mosquito. I loved silence, but here it was simply unnerving. I tried to wake up Dalton, but he's such a deep sleeper that I would have needed some fireworks and an earthquake to wake him up. I grabbed my flashlight out of my bag and went outside the tent. Classic horror movie mistake, you idiot, I thought to myself, but I was curious. Outside the tent, it was pitch black. I looked up and the hundreds of stars that had once comforted me in this damned forest had been replaced by a covering of darkness. I froze. Fear. Shock. I don't know, but I couldn't move. The silence was deafening. At this point, even Dalton's snoring had disappeared. As if this situation wasn't already perfect enough, my flashlight decided it was the perfect time to begin flickering out. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, standing in nothing but darkness. There was nothing but silence. Even my breathing made no sound. And then, a smell. Oh God, the smell. A smell so horrid, it broke me from my trance and I had to immediately cover my nose, but it was no use. The smell of death broke through the barrier and forced its way into my nostrils. I gagged and coughed as the smell only got stronger. Whatever was causing the smell was getting closer. Footsteps. I began to hear footsteps. Loud footsteps. It sounded nothing like something walking through the forest. It sounded like walking on concrete. What the actual fuck is going on? I screamed, in my head of course. Occasionally whatever was walking would step on a fallen tree branch and break it, pausing for a second before continuing its steady pace. My adrenaline rushed and I threw myself back into the tent and zipped up the door. I grabbed onto Dalton's hand, though it felt cold and lifeless. I looked at Dalton and he appeared to be alive. Just not moving. I held tighter onto his hand and threw my other hand over my mouth to hide my panicked breathing. The footsteps had gotten louder and whatever was walking had increased its pace. My heart was beating faster than a bullet train, and the last thing I remember was hearing a deafening, high-pitched scream before I lost consciousness. Babe? Babe, wake up! Dalton said as he shook me awake. I jumped up, hyperventilating and grabbing at Dalton. He threw his arms around me and I began to feel calm again. You were screaming in your sleep. I thought you were having night terrors. My breathing and heart rate began to slow down. Was it just a nightmare? No, it couldn't have been. It felt so real. He grabbed my arm and I felt a burning sensation. I yanked my arm away and saw 3 large gashes going down my arm. What the hell? I said. Damn, babe. You must have scratched yourself in your sleep. Did I? Did I really just dream all that crazy shit that happened? No, I couldn't have. I don't ever remember my dreams, why would I remember that one? Am I just going crazy? Maybe the forest was just messing with my head. I'd heard a lot of stories about people going crazy after being in forests. I had never heard of it happening after just one afternoon, however. Though I guess there's a first time for everything. Dalton tossed my backpack at me. Get yourself changed. I'm gonna go make breakfast. That sounds like one crazy-ass dream. No wonder you were screaming so much. It was terrifying. It felt so real. Well, you don't have to worry anymore, babe. I'm here to protect you. I kissed him and listened to the sounds of the forest again. They were strangely comforting now. Maybe it was just your anxiety. You were pretty freaked out about coming to the forest. Maybe you were just freaking out so much that your brain decided to turn it into a dream. Is that how things work? Possibly. I chuckled and gave him another kiss. And another. And I won't go into too much detail as to what happened next. We spent that day headed north, making sure that we kept walking in the same direction so we didn't lose our campsite. We saw a bear once and I almost lost control of my bowels. In case you were wondering. It didn't see us or it would have done something similar. At least, it would have in my imagination. I'm tough as hell, you know. We got back to our campsite about 3 days later. Or at 6:30 that same day if you ask Dalton. It was ransacked. Our tent was ripped to shreds. What the fuck? Dalton yelled. What the hell did this? Some kind of animal, maybe. I was always super helpful in stressful situations. All our food is still here, at least. But we might have to pack up and head out early. We can't stay here with a shredded tent. It's gonna be dark soon, babe. He sighed and I could tell he was trying to work out a plan. We're still pretty far out. I don't know if we could make it out before nightfall. I don't want to be walking through the forest at night. You know damn well I don't either. Exactly, we might just need to stay here and put on a shit ton of bug spray. Great. The sun went down about an hour later. We lit a fire and just sat up against a tree. I had wanted to carve our names into the tree, but Dalton told me that it would hurt the tree. I was still disappointed, though. Without a proper tent, we were pretty much forced to rough it outdoors for the night. We decided that we would just stay up through the night and head for home at the first sight of daylight. I wish I could say that our plan worked out like we expected it to. After an hour or two, the two of us had fallen asleep, only for us to be abruptly woken up by a loud bang. The fuck was that? I whispered, grabbing onto Dalton's hand. It was suddenly freezing, even though we were still sitting right next to the fire. A fire which had somehow not simmered down even after we stopped tending to it. How is the fire still going? Dalton asked. The forest answered with an ear-piercing screech. I covered my ears, but it didn't seem to help. It only lasted for a few seconds, but my ears kept ringing. I felt blood drip down into my mouth and looked up to see that it was coming from Dalton's ear. He said something about his eardrum busting, but I could barely hear him over the ringing in my own ears. I got up and looked around. I couldn't see anything. What could possibly make that sound? Dalton got up as well, wiping the blood from his ear. He grabbed me and I faintly heard him say that we need to leave. Now. And that was the last thing I heard before everything went silent. The ringing in my ears was gone, and so were the sounds of the forest. I pulled Dalton's arms off of me and it was as if he wasn't even human. Just a mannequin that I could move and twist as I saw fit. This time, there was no darkness. Instead, the light of the fire frozen in time lit up the small clearing that once held our campsite. I heard footsteps and the smell of death found its way into the area. Instead of fear, I was overtaken by a sense of curiosity. I needed to know what was coming, and I needed to see it with my own eyes. And see it I did. Minutes later, a tall human-like figure appeared through the trees. The scent of death grew stronger as it came into the light. My stomach was in knots and I tried my hardest to hold back the acid that was climbing up my throat. The creature stopped and smiled at me. From what I could see there was barely anything holding its skin together as it draped over thin and brittle bones. Its lips were ripped, torn and covered in dried blood. It looked like it hadn't eaten in years and that had me very concerned for my own safety. It stood still for what felt like an eternity, just smiling at me with its rotten, black teeth. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but look it in its dark, sunken eyes. It lifted a finger and pointed at me, still smiling. I could hear snickering, though the creature seemed not to move at all. The laughing grew louder and louder until it was all I could focus on. And then it just stopped, and the creature disappeared. Sound slowly returned and I could hear Dalton calling my name before my ears started ringing again. I turned to look at him and he jumped. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it on my face. He told me there was something written on my forehead in what looked like blood. I went into my backpack and grabbed my small mirror. I sat by the fire and looked at my reflection. And there it was. On my face, written in blood. Wendigo. It seemed as if morning would never come. We waited for hours in the dark for the daylight but found nothing but darkness. I was starting to hallucinate, seeing things that weren't there. Or were they? Dalton would catch me staring into the trees, looking at something. When he would ask what I was looking at, I couldn't answer. My vision started to get blurry. I was seeing white spots and at some points, I just couldn't see at all. I could tell Dalton was starting to get worried. He started cutting through the trees and branches to make a path for us to get out of the forest, but it was no use. Every time we left we would somehow end up back in the same clearing where the fire was still going, though neither of us had touched it in hours. Dalton's hearing was getting worse by the minute. I would call him and he wouldn't respond until he happened to look at me and see that I was trying to talk to him. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but I was starting to get scared that he would lose his hearing permanently. What was most concerning, however, was the lack of sound. It wasn't anything like it was when that thing showed up, but it was still quiet. There were no bugs flying around or any nocturnal creatures roaming about. The only sounds were the ringing in my ears and whatever sounds Dalton was making when he cut down trees. It had been like that for hours, and neither I nor Dalton could figure out why. We were too concerned about getting out of the forest. Well, at this point only Dalton was. I had accepted a fate of being trapped in this forest until the sun came up. If it ever would. I laid down near the fire and rested my head on my arm. I watched Dalton effortlessly tear down trees, and I wished that he would join me by the fire. I called him, but he either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me in favor of escaping. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the fire come over me. I realized that I was starving. Before long, I could feel my consciousness slipping away as I drifted into the sleep that I had been avoiding for hours. I woke up to the sun shining in my eyes from above the trees. The ringing in my ears had stopped, having been replaced by an intense splitting headache. I felt lightheaded and sick to my stomach. Like I had eaten too much. Strange, as I remember feeling completely starved as I fell asleep. I sat up and saw that the fire had finally gone out. I guess Dalton figured out some way to finally get it to Dalton. Where's Dalton? I looked around and didn't see him anywhere. I called out his name and heard nothing in response but the chirping sounds of the forest. I began to panic. I threw my hand over my mouth and tasted blood. I looked at my hand and it was covered in it. I could barely see my own skin. I looked at my other hand. Blood. Everywhere on me, there was blood. What the hell happened? I forced myself to my feet, though it was painful. My legs ached and I felt like vomiting. I could see the shredded remains of our tent on the other side of the clearing, along with our sleeping bags. My backpack was still by the tree. I saw Dalton's by the tent, splattered with blood. My panic worsened and I could already feel my chest beginning to feel tight. I looked around again and saw nothing. I called out his name and heard nothing. I turned around to grab my bag and happened to glance at the tree we had been laying against the night before. Our names were carved into it. We hadn't done that, had we? No, Dalton wouldn't let me. But there it was, plain as day. The knife was still stuck in the tree bark. Right in the middle of Dalton's name. There was blood on the knife. I couldn't remember anything from the night before. I was sleeping, right? Right. I fell asleep, next to the fire. Dalton was cutting through the trees. Or was he? I couldn't remember enough to say for sure, and none of that could tell me where Dalton was now. I could still see the path that he was cutting through the trees, so I stumbled my way over there. The closer I got, the worse the smell of death became. Strangely, I grew calm. The path he cut was short and ended suddenly. Almost like he had been stopped in the middle of cutting. Stopped by me. Dalton's body lay naked against a rotten tree. His stomach had been ripped open and his organs were removed. No, not removed. Eaten. There were bite marks all over his body. There was blood everywhere. Did I do this? I think I did, yes. I was so hungry. I just couldn't stop myself. I was starving. Starving. I managed to find my way out of the forest a few days later. I happened upon a search party that had been arranged after Dalton and I did not return home as expected. They brought me to a hospital and I explained that poor Dalton had been mauled by a mountain lion. They believed me. It was so easy. I returned home after a day in the hospital. They kept me nourished, but could not satiate my hunger. Dalton's body was never found. I attended his funeral just yesterday. Closed casket, of course. I cried as I gave his eulogy. The days move so much slower now. I can feel myself dying from the inside out. I can't hide my hunger any longer. I must feed again before I wither away. Maybe then I won't see that hideous creature I saw in the forest in my dreams. I don't want to see it smile anymore. I don't want to hear its laugh anymore. But still, it calls to me. It tells me what to do. It tells me where to go. It tells me I must eat. Third story. This story was shared by you/Born Beach, so credits to him. Last night something came into my bedroom. I think it left a message. I feel like an insane person saying this, sharing this here, but I don't know where else to go. My mother laughed at me. My own mother. She said it was just a nightmare, sleep paralysis, she said. Perfectly normal. Perfectly common. But what happened to me wasn't normal or common. It's something that's never happened to me before in my life. My mind's going a mile a minute and I can't get my head straight because even now, 12 hours later at 3 in the afternoon, my heart's pounding. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it there. To see him. I need help. I need help. I need help. I need help. But who's going to believe me? Fuck. Let me explain things. I live in an apartment. Nothing big. A single bedroom in an unremarkable part of town, not bad, not good. Just there. Last night I went to bed at the same time as I always do, 10 p.m. after brushing my teeth, turning on my sleep app, and reading my book. I fell asleep in about half an hour. Let's call it 10:30. I'm a side sleeper. Always have been. I'll either sleep facing my bedroom, or toward the wall and the window. My cat, Opie, usually curls up next to me but leaves at some point during the night, either to get a drink, stretch his legs, or because I've moved and he's uncomfortable. Either way, it's rare he'll stay with me throughout the whole night. I'm a fairly light sleeper, so usually when he wakes up and decides to leave, I'll stir briefly before drifting back to sleep. Last night was no different. At least, that's what I'd thought. I woke up facing the bedroom wall. It was dark out, maybe darker than it should have been given the curtain was open and my window is large enough to let in a decent amount of moonlight. But it was pitch. I remember feeling a weight behind me, a small point of pressure pressing into the mattress. Opie, I thought. He was sitting on the other side of me, probably having woken up in the middle of the night and getting ready to go about his way. I closed my eyes. I didn't think anything of it. But then the weight shifted, it pressed down harder, heavier than any cat could be, and my eyes shot open. I couldn't move. I lay there, staring at the wall, my skin prickling and a sensation deep inside of me telling me that something wasn't right. That I wasn't safe. I tried to roll, to confront the strangeness behind me if only to prove that it wasn't there. My body merely rocked back and forth. And then a shadow crept over me. A darkness within the darkness, something deeper than the black of my bedroom. It stretched across my mattress, my sheets, and my breath froze. Still unable to move, I could only gaze sideways as it inched across my wall like a phantom. Something caught my eye. A glint in the window glass. A shape, leaning on my mattress with long arms, its torso bent over and examining me. It looked human, almost. Like a man dressed in a pale cloak, and yet what was underneath it couldn't have been human. It was hard to make out. Difficult to see in the dim, but the creature standing behind me, had no eyes. Where its eyes should have been sat a crown of thorns, and behind that were two deep gouges, rough and bleeding as though carved with a rock. But worst of all was its nose. It didn't have one, not in a human sense. Instead, a long snout protruded from its face, hairless like a pig's and mangled. Its weight shifted on the mattress. The creature moved toward my legs, my feet. I could no longer see it in the reflection of the windowpane, but I could feel it. Hear it. Its nostrils were flaring with gusts of warm air as it moved along my body. It was smelling me, I realized. Taking my scent. It worked its way up to my throat, taking short sniffs, and then it stopped. My heart shuddered in my ribcage as I heard something unfurl. The next moment something heavy and rancid fell over me, and I knew it was that thing's cloak. The pale one. Except now that I was beneath it, feeling its texture against my cheek, I knew that it wasn't fabric. It was flesh. Once more it pressed its flaring snout against my neck, but this time I felt its jaws open. I felt its jaws wrap around my neck, and its teeth scrape across my skin. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could manage was a slurred whimper. Its decrepit fingers crept into my hair, gripping it and pulling my head back. Its jaws moved from my neck and its snout touched the corner of my ears, and then it spoke. Or at least, I think it did. Its voice was a mess, like human vocal cords pulled apart piece by piece and rearranged into something twisted. Still, I recognized one word. My name. At that moment something overcame me. Panic. Fear. I don't know what it was, but I rioted. I rocked my body back and forth with everything I had, knowing that if I didn't break this spell then I was going to die in my bed. All the while the monster kept speaking to me in that unintelligible voice, scraping against my neck with its teeth, painfully gripping my skull with its long fingers. Tears welled in my eyes as I threw everything I had into my shoulder, everything I had into rolling over and breaking this paralysis. And I succeeded. My body lurched and I flipped sideways, my voice cracking as I prepared to confront my own death. But it wasn't there. The dark of my bedroom greeted me, quiet and still. In the corner of the room, my fan spun in lazy circles, blowing air across an empty hardwood floor. There was nobody. Nothing at all but me. Heart pounding, I sat up. My eyes scanned the room 10 times, then I scanned it 10 times more. I looked out the bedroom window and saw my empty balcony, the moon drifting back from behind a series of clouds. Calm down, I told myself. Calm down. I did a breathing exercise, in through the nose, out through the mouth, all the while reminding myself that I was too old for these kinds of nightmares. I lay back in my bed. So often at night we have moments like these, moments where we're halfway between the dream world and our own reality, and it becomes difficult to discern where one world ends and the other begins. I felt like that then. Or at least, I thought I did. I thought it was just as my mother would later suggest, a bad case of sleep paralysis. A vivid night terror. Then my door creaked open. I watched as my cat, Opie, crept into the room growling. His tail was straight up, his ears pulled back, and he looked at me and made a sound he'd never made before in his life. A hiss. He was hissing and growling in turn, stalking back and forth in the center of the bedroom. I slipped from my covers, my feet pressing against the cold hardwood floor. There wasn't any such thing as monsters. Opie probably was reacting to my overreaction, and now I'd gotten him scared to death. Poor guy. I bent down to pick him up, but he squirmed away. Bolted from the room. Confused, exhausted, and emotionally drained, I gave up and turned back to my bed. Something looked back at me from the window. Not from the other side of it, but from within the glass. A reflection. A face with a crown of thorns covering two gouged eyes. I stumbled backward, mouth dry before spinning around and confronting nothing at all. The same empty bedroom I'd always been in. I looked back to the window and saw only my own reflection. No monster. Just a grown man who'd seen one too many horror movies. Shaking my head, I resolved to sleep with the light on in a last-ditch effort to get over this childlike paranoia. As I crawled back into my covers though, I noticed a notification on my phone. My sleep app had registered a new recording. That brings me to now. I've had nightmares before, I've had night terrors and even sleep paralysis. I know what that's like. Last night, I thought I'd had just another case of that, but after I played that recording I couldn't close my eyes. I stayed up all night, curled up with my cat in the living room, eyes peeled with every light on in the suit. It's how I know my mom is wrong. See, the sound that my sleep app picked up wasn't me snoring, it was something else. A voice, I think. I've attached it here in case anybody can help me make heads or tails of it, but please use your discretion. Whatever this thing is, it isn't human. If I'm being honest, I don't even know if it's safe to listen to. But I feel like there's a message inside of the audio. I feel like that creature was trying to tell me something, and I'm afraid that none of this will end until I hear it. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/Zed Belinsky, so credits to him. My grandfather lived in the Warsaw ghetto. My grandfather lived in Poland during World War II, and he used to tell me stories about it. He died several months ago, but I thought that it would be worthwhile to share some of his stories with you. My grandfather was living in Warsaw when Germany invaded. It caught many people by surprise, including my grandfather. The Germans came like a tempest. They swept through the streets of Warsaw with their tanks and their guns and their thirst for blood. My grandfather watched as the city he lived in was ransacked before his very eyes. He told me that the soldiers who invaded couldn't have been human. They were devils who seemed to enjoy executing men, women, and children. They didn't care. They only wanted to see blood. People would try to hide in their apartment buildings, but they were trapped like foxes that had been cornered by hunters. The Germans would surround these buildings, throwing rocks through the windows and ordering people to come out. The people remained in hiding, so the Germans set entire buildings on fire. My grandfather listened to the screams of innocent people being burned alive. Some people tried to jump out of their windows. Many fell to their deaths. Those that survived were quickly executed by German firing squads. One man, who had been set ablaze, jumped from a second-story window and desperately tried to put the flames out. The Germans laughed as they watched this man slowly burn to death, his skin turning first into boils and then to charcoal. A few soldiers walked over to the charred carcass of the man and kicked it. The residents who hadn't been killed were rounded up. They formed ranks while the Germans decided their fate. They were either to be sent to labor camps or to remain in Warsaw, which was now officially under German occupation. My grandfather recounted how there had been a woman standing next to him. She was wearing a torn dress and a veil on her head. She was sobbing. Her wails attracted one of the higher-ranking officers. He came over to her and asked if she wanted to live. She nodded her head and pleaded for her life. The officer told her to run as far away as she could. The woman looked at him, not sure if he was being serious. The officer then barked, "Schnell," and the woman took off. She tried to run, but it was more of a stumble as her legs were constricted by the dress. When the woman made it about 10 yards, the officer turned to his soldiers and nodded. They raised their weapons at the fleeing woman and buried several bullets into her back. She fell to the ground and did not get up. The people who had been captured let out gasps and cries, including my grandfather, who thought this place would be his grave. Nobody knew if the next step they took would be their last. The officers then assigned the prisoners and made them go through an identification process. Whenever it seemed to please them, one of the soldiers would pull out a victim from the crowd. They would tell them to lay down on their stomach, and then bury a bullet into the back of their heads. Many people, my grandfather included, prayed to God for salvation. But on this day, God had turned his back on the city of Warsaw. My grandfather was assigned to remain in Warsaw along with 400,000 other people. They were confined to a mere square mile, their freedom blocked off by impassable walls on all sides. Imagine being on a crowded bus, one which you are not allowed off of. The scent of body odor and fecal matter was overwhelming, as hygiene and sewage systems were forgotten. The dirty smell attracted many pests. While people attempted to sleep, the rats would gnaw on their ankles and the flies would settle on their faces in thick swarms. The proximity of human contact and the presence of vermin helped diseases spread through the ghetto like wildfire. Many people died from typhoid and similar illnesses. Those who died were carried out of homes and left in the streets, their corpses rotting freely and leaving a lingering smell of death and decay. The heat generated by the abundance of bodies made summers unbearable. The lack of fuel and clothes made winters equally as bad. My grandfather was forced to take clothes off of dead bodies in order to survive. The people of the Warsaw ghetto were living in a nightmare. Only they couldn't wake up. It was real. Perhaps death would have been an easier route to take than to endure the horrors that were taking place on a daily basis. As if these things weren't bad enough, the prisoners of Warsaw were under constant abuse from the Gestapo. They would patrol the streets, indiscriminately beating people up who were at the wrong place at the wrong time. My grandfather had been beaten several times, and all he could do was curl up in a ball and pray that he would survive the fists, the boots, and the butts of the Gestapo's guns. Whenever he heard a truck come, he would immediately hide until it passed. There is one story that my grandfather told me that stands out in my mind. There have been similar accounts told on the internet, so I know that he wasn't just making it up. Just picturing it gives me the chills, because it shows what humans can become in times of darkness. What was the number one killer during this time? Not vermin. Not disease. Not the Gestapo. It was starvation. When food ran low, people tried their best to ration their supplies. They also had to protect it from other people who wanted to eat. Fights would break out, and the stronger people got to eat that day while the weak perished. The prisoners became emaciated skeletons whose flesh hung from their bones and their eyes became hollow with hunger. Children wandered the streets, looking through trash for bread crumbs to eat. Here is where my grandfather had his encounter with what he called the hungry man. My grandfather was walking at night, looking for food. It was dark. Most of the street lamps had been smashed by either the Gestapo or frustrated citizens. In the light of one of these lamps, my grandfather saw a young boy. He looked dead at first, but my grandfather could hear him moaning, so he rushed over to him. The boy had collapsed from starvation, and was going to die if he did not get anything to eat soon. My grandfather had no food on him, and he frantically began to search through nearby trashes for anything that was edible. He heard someone coming from a dark alleyway. Fearing it was the Gestapo, my grandfather hid behind a wall. He glanced over it to see who was coming. From the shadows emerged what looked like a wax figure. No, it was a man dressed in rags. He was impossibly tall and thin. He walked in long, graceful strides, like a dancer. My grandfather couldn't see his face from his hiding spot. He watched as this tall man approached the boy and looked around. He then stooped over the boy and began undressing him. My grandfather watched in silent horror as this mysterious man then sunk his mouth into the boy and began to eat him alive. He started from his legs and making his way up. The boy, too weak to cry out, moaned as this stranger devoured him. My grandfather felt sick. He had seen many disturbing things at this point, but none could compare to this night, when he saw the hungry man gobble up a boy that was still breathing. When he was done, the man turned and disappeared into the alleyway from which he had come from. He had picked the boy clean to the bone. My grandfather never saw the hungry man after that. The ghetto was small, and a man of such height would have surely been noticed. It was like he vanished into thin air. My grandfather eventually escaped the ghetto with a resistance group and fled east. He saw more terrors during the war, but he never forgot about the hungry man and the living boy he had eaten. Even when he was out east, he kept looking back over his shoulder, not necessarily for the enemy, but for a slender man who was following him like a shadow with long, creepy strides. I tried to find more information about this hungry man, but I could find nothing. If anyone could find a story about him, or knows anyone who was imprisoned in the Warsaw ghetto and could ask them, please let me know. I would like to find out more about him. Beware the hungry man. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.